Hello everyone, I am Jonathan Little, and today we're going to be going through two fun hands from the 2019 World Series of Poker final table of the main event. This was an exciting tournament. There was lots of fun bluffing, a lot of nitty play. The players were kind of all over the place in overall strategy. Some players made it clear they're only trying to win. They don't care about laddering up. Other players, through their actions, made it very clear they really cared about laddering up. And that created a very interesting final table. Also, the speed of play at this final table was pretty fast after the one slow player busted, and that made for a pretty great viewing experience. But today, I want to review two hands that I thought were particularly educational. So, in this scenario, we're playing 500,000 1 million blinds with a 1 million big blind ante. And in this hand, Martian has king, queen of spades in the hijack seat with a 36 big blind stack. The players yet to act are 40 big blinds, 40 big blinds, 40 big blinds, and then one big stack in the big blinds. This is a great spot to open a little bit wider than normal if you feel like it, because there are no obviously big stacks in position against you. And, you know, everyone was playing somewhat snugly. So anyway, king, queen suited is definitely a hand you're going to want to raise. I like the 2.2 big blind raise size. You may want to go a little bit bigger, like 2.5 big blinds if you see the player in the big blind is defending every time and then fighting kind of hard. But for the most part, I think this is a perfectly fine raise size. Folds around to Gates in the big blind, who does have the big stack, second biggest stack at the moment, with 8-5 of spades, and I think this is a very easy call. Some people just fold in this spot, and that is way too tight. You have to understand, you have to put in 1.2 big blinds to try to win a, 6 big blind pot? So yes, we're out of position. Yes, our hand is not amazing, but are we going to realize our equity 1 in 5 times, 1 in 6 times? We certainly will. And we're at no risk of going broke at all. So I definitely like the call. Flop comes 8-6-4. 3 hearts. And this is a scenario where if you are going to have a leading range, the times you want to be leading are on the low card boards, but generally not on the 3 heart boards or 3 spade boards, 3 of a suit board, because if you lead in this scenario, it allows Martian to very easily call with all decent hearts, which is like 40% of his range. Then he's going to have some pairs sometimes. He's going to have like draws sometimes, like if he randomly has ace-5. So essentially, this is not a great spot to lead because Martian should be continuing a ton. Be a little bit different if there was only 2 hearts on the board. Then leading becomes viable. You usually want to be leading with your strong but vulnerable hands. And straights aren't actually all that vulnerable. What is vulnerable here is a hand like 6-4 or 7-4, because then, say your opponent has aces and a random 6 comes and you have 7-4, that's very bad for you. So this is not a spot where I would be leading pretty much ever. So Gates checks. And now, what does Martian do? Well, you want to ask, who connects better with this board? And the answer is the player in the big blind for sure. Martian's probably not opening too many low, medium connected cards. So for that reason, this board should be way better for Gates, because Gates is going to be defending his big blind for 1.2 big blinds more with a pretty wide range, and all that middle and low stuff connects well with this board. So some people will continuation bet almost blindly with any 2 cards on any flop, but that is definitely a mistake, especially when the board is great for your opponent. And that is the scenario we have here. If you're a Poker Coaching Premium member, you can find that at pokercoaching.com/premium. I have a cash game masterclass where I go through scenarios like this on the flop and explain all of this and explain a system to how you will know when to bet and how much to bet in every scenario that you could possibly be in. So anyway, this is a check. And Martian does check, which is great. Turns a queen. So now, interesting scenario again, right? Who has more queens in their range? Well, obviously, Martian, right? He's going to be checking behind with ace-queen, king-queen, queen-jack, queen-10, queen-9 suited if he has it. And for that reason, Martian has way more queens than Gates. Now, Gates, of course, has lots of queens as well, but he also has all sorts of other stuff, whereas Martian doesn't have a whole lot of other stuff. Also, Martian could bluff with a hand like king-jack, king-10, offsuit or suited, jack-10, etc. if Gates checks, and he probably should be bluffing with those. So I actually don't mind checking, looking to either check raise or check call from Gates, probably check raise. Yes, you will run into flushes sometimes, but you'll also just get a ton of value from a queen, especially if the queen has a heart with it. So checking is certainly viable here because the range advantage just swayed a little bit towards Marchington. That said, I don't mind betting here either. If we are going to bet, though, we want to be betting big. This is a board where you should be betting somewhat infrequently in Gates' shoes because this board connects, or the turn connects very well with Marchington. So we're betting infrequently on a draw-heavy board. When the board is draw-heavy and we're betting infrequently, we want to be betting big. So right here, I think a 5 million bet would be pretty sweet. This may even be a spot for an overbet. Like you could bet 8 million on the turn and then jam the river. I don't think that would be too insane, but I like a 5 million bet. Because if you bet 5 million, now if your opponent does have something like Jack of Hearts, 10 of clubs that got a little bit loose opening, they're probably going to fold to 5 million, whereas if you bet like 2.5 million, they're going to call correctly. So that's not good. Also, if your opponent does have a queen or any pair, like say he did check back pocket tens or pocket aces or whatever, he's going to call every time as well. So when your opponent does have a made hand, they'll call 5 million, like they'll also call 2.5. But also, you'll make your opponent either fold out stuff like a heart, which is fine, or continue with the heart, which is also fine because they're not getting the right odds then. So I definitely like a 5 million bet or larger from Gates. He bets 3.3 though, and notice that if Marchington calls with a heart, he's like not quite getting the right price, but like barely. Plus, he may have a tiny bit of implied odds. So Marchington's not really screwing up if he calls here with a heart. And obviously, he's going to call with top pairs because top pairs are great. So easy call for Marchington. He should not be raising this turn. Some people may think I should be raising here because if I raise, I'll make my opponent fold out their hearts. The problem, though, is that Gates here can just have two pair, straights, sets, flushes. So there's no point in raising here, especially once Gates bets in the scenario, because once Gates bets, he's essentially saying, I either have a good draw or a good made hand. And against the good made hands, Marchington's actually not in that great of shape. So Marchington does call. And now, on the river, same story, right? If Marchington has a heart draw, which I do think he should call with on the turn, he's going to fold to any bet, right? So we are betting big to try to get called by the queens and the pairs. So I like the big bet. However, maybe checking is a little bit better. This is kind of a weird spot because when Gates bets small on the turn, Marchington gets to the river with a bunch of unpaired hands with a heart. Assuming he doesn't bet all those on the flop, which, maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. But if he does have a lot of hands like King of Hearts Jack, or Jack of Hearts 10, or Ace of Hearts 9, you really want to check to let him have the opportunity to bluff, right? So this is a scenario where I actually don't hate checking from Gates. But betting is also fine. If you are going to bet, though, you want to be betting big, because we're trying to get called by a queen or pocket tens or something like that. So I do like that Gates bets big here, and the king-queen just has to call. King-queen's great. It is a hand that's pretty high up in Marchington's range. This is a scenario where a lot of people look at this and say, oh, should I have made a big fold at the final table? And the answer is just no. Your opponent can have plenty of bluffs here, right? Like any 5 would like to bluff. Any heart would like to bluff. For all we know, Gates could be overvaluing a hand like Queen-Jack or Queen-10. So this is a pretty easy call. I do want to point out, though, if we go back here, notice if Gates bet 5 million on the turn, an additional 1.7 big blinds, pot would have been, instead of 12.5 million on the river, something like 16 million on the river, which would then allow him to bet 12 or 13 million. So if Gates used a slightly bigger size here, the exact same outcome would have happened, but he would have priced out draws on the turn, which is great. You don't really just want to let draws get the right price to stick around. And he would have extracted more value from the strong made hand. So he would have ended up with an additional 4 or 5 million chips in the pot. And, you may say that's only 4 or 5 big blinds. That's not that big of a deal. But it really is. Your win rate may only be 4 or 5 big blinds per hour or per 100 hands. Who knows? At these final tables. So if you can extract an additional 4 or 5 big blinds in scenarios like this, that is going to pay off huge in the long run. Let's take a look at another hand. Here, Maz, who was the slow player, don't play slowly. Nothing good really comes from that. He opens at 2.2 big blinds. And then the fast player, Livingston, defends in the big blind. Same story. When you're facing the small raise, you need to be defending the big blind decently often. Flop comes 10, 7, 5. This is a viable spot to lead. I don't hate it. I think it'd be fine. You could also lead here with 10, 7, 10, 5, and 7, 5, and then check your sets. Sure, right? That's certainly acceptable. And then you can lead with your worst draws. And, this isn't the worst draw, but it's a junky one. So leading is viable. You could also check, looking to check raise. I think that's probably what I would have done here. Kind of for the same reason. We don't really want to be check calling out of position with 8 high. It's going to be tough for you to win this pot unless you get there. So I like check raising. And then, similar to the previous hand, Maz has a hand that isn't all that good, and the board's pretty good for the opponent. However, this is a different scenario. And why is this different? Well, Maz actually has some equity. He has some draws, right? And if you bet here with Queen Jack and get check raised, you don't really mind folding it because it's not that great of a hand. So in this scenario, Maz wants to be betting his best made hands in his draws, right? So what are the draws? Well, flush draws are obvious, but there aren't actually all that many of those, depending on how loose Maz is opening. He may or may not have stuff like Jack 9 or Jack 8 suited. He may or may not have, probably has 9-8 suited, but he's not going to have like 9-8 offsuit, right? He probably doesn't have 8-6 suited. So really, there aren't a whole lot of the very obvious draws that you would typically think to bet. So you have to look a little bit more for draws. And it turns out, junky overcards with backdoor straight draws and flush draws often counts as a, quote-unquote draw here. Because you don't really have any other obvious draws. So I think this is a spot where Maz should strongly consider betting as a bluff. Martian 2 would raise, and then Maz would fold the best hand. Yeah, I get it, but that's okay. This is one of the worst hands in his range. Notice Maz also wants to bet aces, kings, queens, jacks, 10s, 7s, 5s, ace 10, king 10, queen 10, jack 10, right? He wants to be betting all these hands just straight up for value. So he does not bet. This time he goes check, check. Turns a 7. Now, some people may be confused in this scenario because a lot of people have been talking recently about when the middle card pairs, that's often good for the player in the big blind. However, they forget one big thing. That's when the preflop raiser bets. When the preflop raiser checks behind, when Maz checks behind here, the most likely value hand he has to check behind is a 7. It's going to be ace 7, king 7 suited, maybe queen 7 suited, stuff like 9-7 suited, 8-7 suited, 7-6 suited. All of these hands would like to check behind the flop. So in this scenario, when it goes check, check on the flop, the 7 is actually better for Maz than for Livingston. Obviously, Livingston could have lots of 7s as well, but the fact that Maz didn't bet, that means he's way more likely to have middle pair or worse for made hands, and then just a lot of junk. So Livingston should not be bluffing here all that often, I don't think, but with this hand in particular, I definitely think he should be betting because it's 8 high, junky draw, you need to be bluffing. So when we're bluffing, how much do we want to be bluffing? Well, if you bet small, your Maz is going to call with a lot of ace highs and better, maybe even like hero calls with king high. So I'm not a big fan of betting small. I think if we're going to be betting, we want to be betting on the bigger side to try to get him off of all hands worse than a 10 by the river. And I do think a bet of like 4 million on the turn and then something like 11 million on the river would get that done. I'm presuming Livingston misses, which happens most of the time. So I think that's probably what we want to do. And I would also do the same play with a 7 to be somewhat balanced. You may say, well, we don't care about being balanced because we're at the final table. We're only playing this spot one time. Who cares about balance? But I typically do approach poker in general from a balanced point of view. And then we exploit to take advantage of whatever our opponents do wrong. But I don't think these opponents do anything too wrong, at least not that I'm aware of at the moment, right? So anyway, I think Livingston should go for a relatively big bet. He goes for a small bet, though, which I guess is fine if you're going to follow it up with a big river bet. And now Maz decides to call. I don't really like this call. And the reason I don't really like this call is because if you think about the draws Livingston's going to be bluffing, it's going to be Jack 9, Jack 8, which we block, right, with the Jack in our hand. And then open-ended draws. Maybe he has like 9-6 suited that would bluff too. But the problem is if your opponent bets the turn and the river, like what are you doing, right? You just lose. And you have to presume a lot of the worst draws, like 8-6, will bet the turn and the river. So I think you just need to fold here even for the small bets. But I get the reason for calling because he beats all the draws, right? Or at least the majority of the draws. It's always brutal when your opponent just has like king high flush draw and you lose. Anyway, he decides to call, which I think is a little bit splashy. And now Livingston rivers the 6. And in this scenario, I think I would typically check. Check and then check call to try to catch bluffs. Maybe the opponent turns ace high or king high into a bluff on the river. Maybe your opponent, if he does have something like Jack 9 to check back the flop for an odd reason, maybe that hand decides to bluff and you can easily call it. So I think that's what I would do. But Livingston takes an interesting line of betting one big blind. Well, does this make logical sense? Well, I haven't studied this exact scenario from a GTO point of view, but there are scenarios where on the river, when you have roughly 55 to 47% equity against your opponent's range, betting minimum does have some merit. And what you want to do is you want to bet small with the very junky made hands, probably a 5 in this case, and then also hands like the nuts, like 7-6, maybe like 10% of the time, and then some bluffs like 5% of the time. Maybe if your opponent's going to be raising you a lot, you're a little bit more nut heavy. If your opponent's going to be folding a lot, maybe a little bit more bluff heavy. But I think this hand's probably a little bit too good to do that. I think this hand's probably better off played as a check call. But I definitely get the idea of making this min bet here, especially if your opponents have no real idea of what your range looks like. And even if they do, as long as you have some nut hands here, you're going to be decently well protected. Because like if you bet 1 and they make it 12, right? If you just have the nuts, even a small portion of the time, they're going to be lighting their money on fire, bluffing blindly. So now, what does Queen Jack do for one big blind? Well, does it beat any bluffs? Well, think about this, right? 9-8 got there. 8-6 and 6-4 got there. 9-6 got there. All you beat here is Jack 9 and Jack 8. 4-3 even got there. Yeah, somehow it's 4-3. So yeah, all you're really beating here is Jack 9 and Jack 8. But we have a Jack in our hand, which is awful, right? Because now we block the Jack 9 and Jack 8. So even getting amazing odds, I think this is just a fold. You could certainly bluff. I think bluffing is viable. Because we're trying to get our opponent to fold out a 6 or a 5, right? If we are going to bluff, we want to use a big size. You don't want to go 4 million or so, because if you go 4 million, then your opponent is going to call with a lot of their junky hands like 8-6, right? Like, I don't even think that would be that bad to call 3 million more into a, I mean, how much it would be? It'd be like 17 million chips, right? I don't think that would be that bad. So if you are going to raise here in Ma's shoes, you want to make it 12. Make sure you are, somewhat stoic. Don't get all loose and then make a weird raise after obviously considering, oh, should I actually fold? Maybe a Hollywood makes sense, but try to not do all that too much. Try to be stoic at the table so your opponents can't get reads on you. The problem with getting loosey-goosey, as some call it, is that you never really know what you're giving away. And if you get loosey-goosey in very consistent ways, and your opponents are paying attention, which they clearly are at the final table, then they may pick up something that allows them to crush you. And you don't want them to be able to crush you. I played with a guy just the other day in a cash game where every time he went all in with the nuts, he would say, screw it, I'm all in. Every time. 3 times in a row within 3 hours. And if you know your opponent always says anything in particular when they have the nuts or when they're bluffing or whatever, then that makes their life easy, right? Because instead of calling with my bluff catchers, I just don't. And when he's in the reverse scenario where I have the nuts, he's going to have to call with his bluff catcher sometimes. And I just extract tons of value because of that mistake in his strategy. So anyway, we're getting off topic here. In this case, I think the Queen Jack should either raise huge, like 12 million, or fold. And I probably would just fold, but I would not be opposed to dialing it up to 12 million. So we just reviewed 2 hands from the World Series of Poker main event final table, and I actually have 50 of these hands loaded up. Like I said, this was a great final table. In previous years, there's only been like 25 good hands, but this year there were a ton. And I'm excited to be reviewing all of those for you. All of the details for how you can get the full 50-hand replay is below, so check that out. I hope you enjoyed a lot. I've worked very hard on this production for you, and I am sure, actually I know, it's very educational because I've been learning a lot going through it as well. Like I said, we have lots of really aggressive action, especially from the winner. You probably all know who won by now. No spoilers. Lots of aggression action from him. Also some relatively snug folds, which we'll discuss them. Maybe they're good, maybe they're not. We had a few ICM blunders where people punted away stacks. But those people admittedly said, hey, I don't care if I punt away my stack. I'm playing for the win. And we'll discuss if that is good, if that is bad. And, good and bad depend on what you're trying to accomplish in life and in the tournament. So we'll be discussing all of that and more. The full details are below this video. That's going to be it. Good luck in your games. Have fun. Sign up below. And I'll see you there.